Welcome to another episode of the Einstein Retirement Daily, where we curate financial, economic, and market news for the headlines that affect today's retiree. Today's topic: how to discover your best spending rate in retirement, an article from CNBC. We're going to cover that with some depth today. As always, should you hear something based on today's podcast that causes you to want to take some action, to do something, please understand that this podcast should not be considered specific tax, legal, or investment advice. If you hear something today that you like, that causes you to want to do something and take some action, please consult with the appropriate tax, legal, or investment professional who knows your specific circumstance prior to taking any action. Carmen Reinke, I'm not sure how to say your name, Carmen, I'm sorry for that, wrote an article today in CNBC entitled How to Discover Your Best Spending Rate in Retirement. This article certainly piqued my interest because I'm always curious what folks that we interact with here at Einstein Retirement Workshops are hearing out, in other groups and other circles, in the articles that they're reading, in the publications that they're consuming, news that they're taking in. So this certainly piqued my interest, and it's right in line with topics that we talk about with clients all the time. What kind of spending rate is reasonable, affordable? What can you actually pull off? Now, this article is maybe not the best article. I did find one quote in it that was a little bit funny. The article's not great, but I think what we can do is actually answer that question. So let me just cover a couple things. First of all, in the article, I did notice that there is a quote from Steve Vernon, who's a consulting research scholar at the Stanford Center of Longevity. His quote is, "People are trying to hold on to their money because it makes them feel more secure to see a pile of money. I like to call it Scrooge McDuck syndrome." Now, Steve, that's not very nice. Awfully pessimistic of you. I mean, certainly there's another way to view this, don't you think? Let me provide some insight if I can. So our firm works with more than 1,500 new folks every year who are gearing up for retirement. So let me just give you a little bit, maybe, certainly a less pessimistic view than the Scrooge McDuck syndrome. Jeez. It's like we assume that people who have money and don't want to spend it are somehow, Scrooge-like. I don't find that to be true in most circumstances. Let me tell you what we are seeing, and I'm certain that many of you will feel an affinity towards this. So it's primarily driven from uncertainty and fears. So you have things like inflation, medical costs later in life, which are totally a wild card. Poor economic or market conditions create uncertainty for people. Many people have never had a budget before. They've made enough money. They've always spent, within their means. They've put dollars away. They've taken advantage of 401k matches and other provisions. I mean, let's be honest, income makes people safe. It makes people feel safe. So in the same way that employment income provides some stability and certainty for people as they gear up for retirement, people will view things like pension benefits and Social Security benefits sort of as that baseline, cover your basic needs level of income. So that's sort of the starting point. The fact that they don't want to touch their savings is mostly fear-driven. So I see so many times people who have saved good amounts of money in their retirement accounts and brokerage accounts and other things, but they're very uncomfortable transitioning into spending those dollars that they've been putting in for years and years, again, primarily because of uncertainty. Okay, so maybe I'll find an email of Steve Vernon and send him a note saying, hey, maybe lose the Scrooge McDuck syndrome issue here. A little too pessimistic for my taste. Okay, here's where the article falls flat. Let me just outline the article and give you a sense of why I'm sort of not feeling great about it, but it did spawn some thoughts, and so I want to actually answer the question of the article. Remember, this article is entitled, How to Discover Your Best Spending Rate in Retirement. It tries to answer that question by identifying some key topics. First, it starts that generally retirees aren't spending much from their savings. That's true. A lot of people we see are not really doing any spending, or just very little and small amounts of spending is what we see folks doing out of their retirement savings. So that's just true. We're seeing that. We think that some of that is because of nervous factors, okay? Various factors people are nervous about, and that prevents them from spending out of their savings. And the article highlights that. The article then goes on to highlight some tips. So here's the tips. Think about how much you have in your accounts. I mean, there's a little bit more words to that, but essentially it's just basically saying, do an accounting, get a list of your accounts. That doesn't quite cut it. That's not really in-depth enough to identify a spend rate, but it is an important component. Okay, the next tip was figure out how much you spend now and try to build a plan based on that. Okay, again, that's good advice, right? Good advice. Oftentimes people who go from working to then retirement don't necessarily adjust their spending that much. So, reasonable thing to do, look at how much you're actually spending. But that still doesn't answer our question of how to discover your best spending rate. It sort of gives you an idea of what you might need, but it's not really answering how do we know how much we can spend from our savings. The next one is the next tip that is, plan where to start taking withdrawals from. I feel like there should be crickets playing in the background. Yeah, okay, but that still doesn't tell me how much to spend. You know, there's really no specifics in that section, but I will say the specifics that should have jumped out in that section really is in regards to taxes. So I'll touch on that in a minute. Okay, the next tip. I think this is the last tip. Let me check. Yep, last tip. Start with a plan, but recognize you might need to change it. Again, I feel like I should be hearing more crickets. Yet, unfortunately, the article never really addresses the question how to discover your best spending rate in retirement. But it's such a good question that I really wanted to spend some time and just try to answer that for you. Sorry, for those of you watching on video, I'll try to move so you're not getting blinded by the sun shining through the clouds behind me. It's a beautiful sight, but I don't know if you want that in your eyes. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. If you are starting from ground zero, let's say you have no idea how much you can effectively spend from your retirement savings, you're kind of coming to this as a blank slate, I'm going to kind of give you some starting points, some things that would be good to begin thinking about. I generally would recommend that you work with a planner, someone who has some expertise in retirement planning, can demonstrate that expertise, and knows the research around retirement spending to help you develop a real plan around this. That's just so important. But let's just assume that you don't do that for a minute. If you're starting from ground zero, you don't have any real starting point, you're not sure how much you can spend effectively, you need some advice, let's do that right now. Number one, anticipate how long your retirement could last. My granddaddy lived to the age of 92. He had 4 heart attacks and 3 bypass surgeries before the age of 75. Planning for I can't remember when he retired, but I want to say he was in his maybe 60s, early 60s, maybe 60 years old. He retired fairly early. I do know that. Although he worked part-time for a while, my grandparents moved to Orlando, Florida in the 70s, and he drove the bus around Kissimmee. Kissimmee is, of course, where the theme parks are, Magic Kingdom and all that. So he did do some part-time work, and I think that sort of transitioned him into retirement. But the key is if you had asked him, hey, do you want to plan for a 30-year retirement, he'd have just laughed at you. I mean, nicely, because he was a very nice guy, but he would have thought that was funny, but he would have said, no way. There's no way I'm going to live that long. I've already had 4 heart attacks. 3 bypass surgeries by the age of 75. If you'd asked him at 75, you may think you'll make it to 85, he'll say, if I'm lucky. So, the fact that he made it to 92 was a surprise, and many people are living much longer than they think. Why is that so important? Because the longer you need your savings to last, theoretically, the less you can reasonably spend with low risk. Okay, that's the key, with low risk. You might be able to spend the same amount whether you're retired for 20 years, 15 years, 30 years, 40 years. You may be able to spend the same amount regardless of when, but not at the same risk level. The longer you need your funds to last, the more risk there is in a higher spend rate. Okay, so that's critically important. Let's take a more simple example that doesn't require you to guess your date of expiration. Retiring at 55 versus retiring at 75. If you live to 95 and you retire at 55, you need your savings to last 40 years. If you retire at 75 and live to 95, your savings only needs to last 20 years. You can spend more as a spend rate retiring at 75 and do it with a lower risk factor than you can retiring at 55. Not rocket science, but it gives you a starting point. So think about, how long could I live? How long will this money need to last me? Bear in mind also, this goes right into number 2. Number 2 is consider retirement spending rules of thumb. Okay, the old rules of thumb. The rule of thumb around retirement spending begins at the 4% rule. And then it needs to be modified depending on how long you live and other various factors. Some would say right out of the gate that the 4% rule is too high, and they have an argument, but that is going to be mostly derived based upon expected inflation rates and your investment strategies. However, go back to just the rule of thumb. A 4% spend rate is based on a 30-year retirement. So if you're the person retiring at 55, living to 95, that's 40 years, not 30. So is your rule of thumb spend target 4%? Not with the same risk level. You might be okay at 4%, but you're definitely not the same at the same risk level. The more years you have to be retired, the more opportunities there are for negative events to occur. Okay, it's just a simple law of averages or probability. Okay, if I play the lottery 1,000,000 times, I have a much higher opportunity to win than if I play 100 times. Although if I play 1,000,000, I probably don't have that much higher of an opportunity. Okay, but hypothetically, right? Hypothetically, if I play the lottery 1,000,000 times, I have a much better chance of winning than if I play 100 times. Same is true in retirement. If I'm going to be retired for 40 years, I have a much higher probability of negative events hurting some of my spending goals than if I'm only retired for 10 years, just law of probability, okay? So the longer you're expecting to retire, the lower you need to go off of that 4% rule. The 4% rule is derived off of a 30-year retirement. Now, if you want to be more conservative, you want to increase your success likelihood, then drop it down to 3%. You're going to be down closer to the current research standards that we're seeing coming out. Although it's not a blanket for sure that that's good research. Okay, so I could talk about that maybe in another podcast. But there is reason to say that maybe the 4% rule is optimistic on a 30-year retirement. So if you want to go more conservative, just drop it down to 3%. Okay, thirdly, so number 1 was anticipate how long your retirement could last. Number 2 was consider retirement spending rules of thumb. Number 3, consider your investments. What do I mean by consider your investments? Like, look at my holdings. I got some S&P 500 or what? Like, what are you asking, Kyle? What I'm asking you to do is to have a reasonable basis to garner an expected future rate of return. not just what you've done in the past. What you've done in the past is not going to repeat itself. So don't base your future expectations on what your investments have done in the past. You could do better, you could do worse, okay? Too many variables to know which way it's going to go, but a reasonable return expectation needs to consider current market conditions, current monetary policy, and then certainly interest rate environment that we're in. Reasonable expected rate of return on your portfolio. Get that. That's going to be your average case scenario. Okay? Average case scenario. If you can get just a hair bit more sophisticated, toss in there a couple of bad years where your investments, you say an expected rate of return is 6%. Don't assume 6% is the return every year. You need to have some variance. Some years are better than 6%, some years are worse than 6%. You might even have a negative year in there. Okay, if you want to be reasonable, you got to include some of those variables. What is the best case? You should know the best case. Okay, if you're in the best case, you're probably fine for most of the time, right? Unless your expected rate of return is 1%, then the best case might be 1.5%, okay, that sort of thing. But assuming you have a fairly normal investment portfolio for retirement, once you know your average, you should kind of have a sense of what your best case scenario is. But more importantly, you should also know what your worst case scenario is. How would you expect your portfolio to perform in a worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is not a lower return happening every year. That might be better than your average return with some ups and downs. Okay, volatility of returns highlights what is called sequence of return risk. Not to overcomplicate this, but if you're looking for some tips, know about sequence of return risk. Once you have your worst case scenario, make sure your worst case scenario includes starting retirement with some losses. So you retire and your investments immediately experience some downturns, experience some losses. How does that worst case scenario affect you over the long haul in the long run? Consider your mental health. Okay, so in considering your investments, you need to know what a good expected average is, best case and worst case, and then consider your mental health on the worst case. Well, really it's your mental health just in general. Do you need a plan that even in that worst case, you're fine? Or are you the type of person that's okay, as long as my average is good, I'm good? Just answer that for yourself, okay? If you need a portfolio where the worst case needs to be in good shape, then that will affect your spend rate. Consider survivor needs if you're married. Very important. Sorry for those of you who are single. Don't tune out. I got another good one coming up about taxes. But if you're married, survivor needs are very important to consider. Many pension benefits don't offer 100% survivor. If they do, great, but you still have to deal with Social Security. When one of you passes away, one Social Security check is gone. How are we going to make up for that lost income? How are we going to do that? Need to consider that. And so the second issue tied into that is, what if one of you has a serious medical condition that adds and racks up a lot of expenses and then they pass away? So now we have a scenario where we've had to spend a lot of extra money at the end of one of your lives, and then the surviving person has less money and a lost Social Security or a reduced pension. You see the issue. So you need to have some things in mind around that, especially if you're married. Last one, number 5. Okay, so let me briefly cover again. Number 1, anticipate how long your retirement could last. Number 2, consider retirement spending rules of thumb and work off of that based upon your individual situation. Consider your investments. Number 3, what's a reasonable expected rate of return? Work off of that for your comfort and mental health. Number 4 was, for those of you who are married, consider what happens when one of you passes. Number 5, taxes. Tax efficiency makes a big difference in your spend rate. If you enter, I'm going to give you an example of where this makes the biggest difference. When you're in retirement, you should know your tax torpedo corridor on Social Security taxes. So when you pay tax on Social Security, it is a complex calculation that requires a 19-step process on a worksheet produced by the IRS in Publication 915. That 19-step process, when you go through it and you understand how it works, it creates a corridor where you're not being taxed on all your Social Security, but every extra dollar of income that you add will add additional taxes to Social Security. This is called the tax torpedo. That window between the max tax on Social Security and no tax on Social Security, I call the Social Security tax torpedo corridor. That corridor, if you're in the 22% tax rate, could mean that you are experiencing an effective tax rate of 50% if we consider also the possible effects on Medicare and increased Medicare Part B premiums. So even though you might be in the 22% marginal rate, you may be experiencing a 50% effective tax rate on income. This is obviously a major impact. If you were planning on spending 2% of your portfolio, but you're losing 50% of it to taxes, you actually need to spend 4% to net the 2%. Or if you're planning on spending 3%, you may need to actually draw down 6% to net the 3%. Very important to consider tax efficiency in your retirement spending plan. Okay, I hope that helps. I hope that makes a difference for some of you and really provides a benefit. It is such a wonderful question. How in the world do we discover the best spending rate in retirement? As always, I will link the article. I do hope that if you found this to be very beneficial, please share it, like it, let people know that you found it to be helpful. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow our Facebook page. We'd love to see you at one of our live workshops if you think that could be helpful to you. We love doing them. We love seeing people at them and helping you with other retirement planning topics and needs that you may have. With that, we will wrap up for today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.